And let me return to a word that you used there, which is nuance. I feel that nuance is precisely what gets lost in our politics in so many aspects of the culture today. And let me answer the question that you posed a bit earlier, which is that the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. is a nonpartisan think tank, but one that actually tries to look in that middle space where left and right aren't looking. It seems to me that so many people have blinders on, imposed by their own ideologies, that when it
Yeah.
comes to not just policies, but just the way of thinking about the world, they're actually unable to address the world in all of its complexity.
So let me set this up properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, my podcast, and my guest today is Geoff Kabaservice. Say your last name correctly,
You did.
Kabaservice. And the book that we're going to talk about today, he's written a bunch of things, but Rule and Ruin, the Downfall of Moderation and the Destruction of the Republican Party from Eisenhower to the Tea Party. It's an Oxford University Press book, came out in 2012. But as I mentioned to Geoff a few minutes ago, it's so important for right now, because if anybody asks the question, well, what happened to the Republicans? The must read is Geoff's book, because it'll explain a lot to you about what happened to the Republicans. Geoff's written for numerous national publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Politico, and The Guardian. And Geoff has been a visiting assistant professor at Yale University, and his research interests include politics, education, centrism, and moderation, which is really important. I don't want to blow by those, because the Niskanen Center is all about centrism and moderation, and so you're putting your money where your mouth is and actually working on projects we'll talk about, and the history of the Republican Party. In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, that's what you're listening to or watching, and I'd ask you to subscribe right now on YouTube, and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and also to my Substack commentary page. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And one thing I want to mention is, though your book came out in 2012, it's very much of the moment, which I already said. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read. Better late than never. We would like to make it an offering for August, if we could, and include the book and get people reading it. Because I just, as I said, I reread it last night and this morning, and I have so much to ask you about, but it's odd because it's before Trump runs for the presidency the first time, and yet actually your book on what happened to the Republican Party is the answer to everybody's questions of how could this be. So the first thing I want to ask you about is kind of to update what you would say in an afterword or a new preface if the book was out in paperback now, in terms of saying, okay, I laid the basis for what happened to the Republican Party, the Tea Party, and all the rest of it that gave us Donald Trump. But the jump from that to where we are today is as big as the jump was from Eisenhower to the Tea Party, is the only way I can put it, having just read your book. And I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think that's a correct way to see it?
I do. Let me say, first of all, Frank, I deeply appreciate your kind words about my book. And
Yeah.
it's a real pleasure to be talking with you today because, as we also were talking about earlier, you knew many of the people that I wrote about as historical figures.
Yes.
They were real flesh and blood humans, even friends, in many cases. And so
Correct.
it's very meaningful to me to be able to run my take as a historian against your experiences in this world.
Well, and I'll mention something, and I don't mean to be over complimentary, because I really did like your book, so I can't say enough good about it. But one of the things is that, if you know someone personally and someone writes a book about it, who's a historian or a sociologist or in a sort of an academic approach, the first thing you say to yourself is, did they get this bit right? I don't know everybody in your book, but the ones I do know, I can tell people that you got totally right. And for instance, Jack Kemp is someone I knew very well, and I would stay in his home, and I met the people who were his mentors, like Laffer and others. I met Bob Dole through him, and so forth and so on. And your description of how Jack very much was not a racist, for instance, because he had been a quarterback on football teams with black players that he knew well as personal friends and colleagues. you got some very important information in there about Jack, and some other people, also Bill Buckley, who I knew in a weird way because my dad was running this ministry in Switzerland of all places, and we were one valley over from where Bill Buckley had a chalet in Gstaad. He was very much into the good life and would come over and have tea with dad and talk about how he had a dinner the night before with David Niven and actors and all these people. So he was living a very kind of glamorous life compared to ours. But and I know this is apropos of nothing, but just one thing was interesting to me. The the media, the sort of gatekeeper media represented best by the New York Times, missed so much about our part of the rise of the religious right by not reviewing the books, say, that my father was writing and so on. What was so interesting to me is that when my dad died, having been sold millions of copies of these books that basically, with C. Everett Koop and some others, created the abortion issue as a kind of a litmus test for the Republicans. The New York Times didn't even do an obituary. Now, 20 years later, when my mom died, they did an above the line obituary because by that time they were starting to pay attention. Well, who are these evangelicals? We better learn something about them. But Bill Buckley ran a very effusive obituary in the National Review after my dad died. And so that kind of personal road into your book meant a lot to me reading it, because I think one of the points that I took away from your book is how little known this history remains. And basically I was learning a lot from your book anyway about the Tea Party and other movements that I knew about, but I hadn't really gotten into the roots of it. And then, of course, going way back into my own childhood again, we would get these what my father would regard in those days crazy right wingers from the John Birch Society and these other places who were saying that Eisenhower was a communist and so forth. So I just want to say, I think your book is incredibly important, and the scope of it really kind of blew me away because it's the most complete history. I'd go further than that. It's the only history of what's happened to the Republican Party that I've ever read. And anybody who thinks that what happened between Eisenhower and Ronald Reagan is apropos of nothing much doesn't understand where we're at today. So I knew Pat Buchanan. I knew all these guys. Hung around with them quite a bit, would get messages and calls from them when I was my dad's sort of nepotistic sidekick when he was on the frontiers of the religious right. And so reading your book was odd for me because there was a lot of stuff in there that I kind of don't want to think about anymore because we were part of something that's gone so horribly wrong. And I really feel bad about it for the part that we played. And then it went so much further than anything that even the people in the religious right could have imagined. And fast forward to the Trump administration today, my dad would have just been so shocked. So, okay, that's an unusually long preamble, but I don't usually interview authors who have written books about where I live.
Well, thank you so much for those very kind remarks. And it means a lot to me that you feel that I got someone like Jack Kemp right
Yes.
in personal experience. I suppose I should also add that in the 1990s, I was a graduate student at Yale in history.
Mm.
And to make money, I signed up to be a research assistant for someone I'd never met named Sam Tannenhouse. And it turned out his project was to write the authorized biography of Bill Buckley.
Yeah.
And that book is just now coming out in publication in June of 2025. So it's
How
been a
interesting.
wait for this. And I used to then go down to Stamford, Connecticut, where Bill Buckley lived at his home in Wallack's Point, and talk
Yeah.
to him because I was very interested in what I was finding in the archives. And at that point, nobody really in academic history was studying either the conservative movement or the Republican Party.
Yes.
With a wide open field of inquiry for the would-be scholar.
Hmm.
That part was great. And Bill Buckley was very kind to me, even
Mm.
though we were not completely aligned philosophically or
Yeah.
politically. And he actually told me a lot about his own experiences in both the conservative movement and then with the Republican Party that I then
Mm.
later was able to incorporate into my book on the history of the moderate faction of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
But it was just to add one more thing here. The whole subject of conservatism and the Republican Party were in such academic disrepute
Yeah.
when I went into the Yale Library, which has literally millions of books, to try to find a copy of Barry Goldwater's campaign manifesto
Hmm.
on his that he co-wrote with Brent Bozell on his reflections of being a conservative, the library didn't have a copy.
Wow.
And the same thing was true. You know, the obscurity in which your father labored as far as the New York Times and the institutions of the liberal establishment were concerned, you know, they might
Yeah.
not have existed. And yet that meant that when Ronald Reagan triumphed and conservatives kept winning elections after 1980, they were completely at a loss to explain how this could be.
Yeah.
And so I went about for both of my books that I was writing at that time was to try to provide some of the history, as it were, of what had happened to the Republican Party over the course of that 40-year cycle that you're describing.
Yeah, and I think a tremendous contribution your book makes begins with the title, because the very fact that there were Republicans who can be described as moderate, not only in their politics, but as human beings. These were not bomb-throwing crazy people. And the distance between them and today's Republican Party was far less, or far greater, I should say, than the distance between them and their political colleagues on the left during the times they were in the Senate and Congress. In other words, Jack, for instance, and even Reagan at his period of history was still talking to Democrats, and the bipartisanship was a possibility. And today just seems, you know, impossible. So let me dive into the book itself here. The first thing I want to do is just talk about the quality of your guests on your own podcast. So rather than just start with the book, why don't you describe the Niskanen Center and what you do, and also this incredible podcast you have that I dipped into. I listened to bits and pieces of about half a dozen pieces today, read some of the transcripts. Talk about that, because that itself is a great resource, and I'd like to point people toward it.
Well, thank you again. You know, at the risk of being a little self-referential here,
Yeah,
by writing about conservative subjects and the so-called dead white men, I basically
yeah,
made myself unemployable on the academic job market, as it turned out, in the late 90s and early 2000s.
yeah,
And so then the question was, well, what do I do with my life, given that all I had really ever wanted to be was in the classroom and to
yeah,
be a professor? And I ended up doing things like consulting and working in with hospitals and health systems. And I found that, you know, financially rewarding, but in the other way, unrewarding.
yeah,
So that was when I started to write my first book, which was essentially on meritocracy and the change that had happened to universities during the 1960s. And my
yes,
principal subject was Kingman Brewster, who was a 16th generation lineal male descendant of the head of the Mayflower and
yeah,
president at Yale in the 1960s and 70s. And one of the aspects of his biography that I found puzzling was that he was a liberal Republican.
yeah,
Thought, what does that even mean? That's a contradiction in terms.
yeah,
That's jumbo shrimp. It's an oxymoron.
yeah, yeah,
But in fact, you know, there was a faction of the Republican Party in those days that saw itself as being in direct descent from Theodore Roosevelt, and that had ideas that we would consider to be liberal, but also they considered themselves to be capitalists.
yeah,
And this, you know, one of several factions in the Republican Party that were actually quite robust. There were moderate Republicans who I would identify as Dwight Eisenhower
sure.
type of people, you know, generally conservative, generally coming from a corporate background, but
Mm,
interested the greater public good and what Republicans could do to contribute to that, very much in
yeah,
the Abraham Lincoln line of thinking. And then there were the people I call Taftites, who probably identified most with Robert Taft,
mm,
was the son of the president.
sure.
And these were, generally speaking, people from small towns in the Midwest, especially small
Mm,
business men and women, conservative Protestants, I would say, for the most part, but not necessarily ideological conservatives.
yeah,
If you're talking about ideological conservatives, these people who we knew to be so well, you know, coming up particularly from the South and West of the United States, who coalesced behind Barry Goldwater's presidential candidacy in 1964, that was actually the smallest faction in the
yeah,
Republican
yeah,
in 1960. So it was just a very different kind of way of thinking about American politics and ideology. As you point out, there was actually a lot of ideological overlap.
Mm.
between Republicans and Democrats at that
Yeah.
time. Bipartisanship was a very strong factor, partly because so many of the members of Congress had served together in World War II
Yeah.
and saw each other as fellow combatants against a great evil, not as enemies. So it was a very different time, and recovering that struck me as a worthwhile project.
Yeah, and there are things that I'm thinking of again from my own experience that tie very much into your book. And I wanted to ask you about because I think again a general lack of general knowledge about who Republicans were, who evangelicals were, and how they regarded what was at that time the radical right fringe of their own movement, like the John Birch Society and so forth. People today don't seem to get that idea. And one area where I was literally in the room, so to speak, so of which, I know what I'm talking about on this was when we went out with our anti-abortion film, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that we made with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who then became Ronald Reagan Surgeon General. Our fight was not with the quote secular humanists. Our fight was with the evangelical leadership that was pro-choice. People don't get that. I didn't say ambivalent about abortion. I mean pro-choice, like the editors of the evangelical flagship magazine, Christianity Today magazine, that refused to write a review of the film series because they said this is not an evangelical issue. It's a Catholic issue. And they would have agreed with quote unquote liberal Democrats at that time in those views. I was in the room with Reverend Billy Graham and my dad when they argued about this, and dad asked for his support. And he said, no, this isn't our issue. I don't think we should be telling women that they can't have abortions. And Billy Graham also, who desegregated his meetings from 1952 forward, and got a lot of blowback from the Southern Baptists and so forth. Dr. Criswell, who is the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and pastor of First Baptist in Dallas, who refused to appear on the stage with us when we showed up on the abortion film, whereas 3 years before he brought his entire congregation to our seminar on art and culture for a project called How Should We Then Live? I don't think a lot of people understand that it isn't that evangelicalism took over the Republican Party and turned it conservative. Evangelicalism itself was overtaken by culture war issues that were not even on its radar screen when we first went out with some of these issues. And I think that also includes Jerry Falwell's anti-gay rhetoric. He had to turn that into a thing. This was not, people did not live and breathe this. So I just want to throw that out to you, first of all, as someone who studied this. Let's talk about these things that neither the left nor the right want to talk about. The left wants to paint all evangelicals and Republicans as right-wing insane people who are MAGA people. They don't want to talk about a history that's much more nuanced. They don't want to see the word moderate linked to Republican. And then on the left, the same thing, because of course the left wants to see the Republicans as all one thing and always has been. So it seems neither side in our culture war wants to embrace the truth of your book, which was, first of all, there were moderate Republicans. They were not all racists. They were not all anti-gay. They did not speak with one voice on women's issues and the abortion issue. So why don't you talk about just that for a minute? Because that's sort of a through line of your book that isn't stated as such in the same way I've just put it, but it's really what your book is about, because you're documenting who these people were.
Well, thank you again, Frank. And let me return to a word that you used there, which is nuance. I feel that nuance is precisely what gets lost in our politics and so many aspects of the culture today. And let me answer the question that you posed a bit earlier, which is that the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. is a nonpartisan think tank, but one that actually tries to look in that middle space where left and right aren't looking. It seems to me that so many people have blinders on, imposed by their own ideologies, that when it comes to not just policies, but just the way of thinking about the world, they're actually unable to address the world in all of its complexity. And on my podcast, which is called The Vital Center, appropriately enough, I'm often bringing on people who have written books that seem to me to actually get at these hard to process details that you're describing. So one of the authors that I had on somewhat recently was Jonathan Rauch, who's a scholar at the Brookings Institution.
Who, by the way, we interviewed.
Yes, and even though he, as you will know, is a sort of gay atheist
Yeah.
raised in Jewish tradition, he actually very much feels that the American experiment won't work unless it actually has the bolstering of what he calls strong Christianity,
Yeah.
as opposed to the sharp Christianity into which the evangelical movement has descended as it has become more partisan, and then also the weak Christianity of the mainline Protestant denominations.
Yes, very
Once
much
did
so.
so much to shape American culture.
Yeah.
And I do remember in my own research into conservatism and the movement that it seemed to me that the reason why evangelicals were pro-choice, as you put it,
Mm.
not opposed to abortion, was that they associated the anti-abortion cause with Catholicism.
They did,
And
yes. And Catholics
anti-Catholicism
were
was
going to
so
go to hell
central.
because they weren't Christians. You know,
Yes,
when I grew up in the fundamentalist stage of our family that then changed a little bit, you know, we had missionaries to the Catholics because they weren't real Christians.
yes, and anti-Catholicism was so central to a certain kind of evangelical, Protestant
Sure.
identity that the idea of cooperating with them on abortion would have seemed quite radical. And when that did happen, when there actually was cooperation on that issue, that really shifted the political landscape at the same time that politicians like Ronald Reagan were shifting the political picture. And also that intellectuals like Bill Buckley were driving forward the conservative movement in ways that made it much more interesting and acceptable and even exciting to people than it had appeared for many decades.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting jumping into something you did. I think Mark Duckelman, you said in your podcast with him that David French wrote in a recent newsletter that generational challenge we face in the United States is, quote, rooted in a national sense, cutting across races and classes, that our country just doesn't work any longer, that a nation once capable of greatness is stagnant, mired in failure and incompetence. You know, that would be the one thing that I think both sides on all these issues would agree to. There's this sense of that things aren't working anymore. And going back to your book again, what strikes me about the way Jack Kemp worked, and the Republican Party before the Tea Party, the whole Eisenhower administration and so forth, is they were able to take, absorb, and use some things that Democrats did in terms of civil rights and Social Security and these other things and build from them. They regarded, you know, they opposed tax increases and so forth, but the idea that somehow they were in opposition to the parts of government that worked was just not part of the program. That's not where they were coming from. They accepted these things as a fait accompli at worst case, and often embraced them as a good step forward in terms of some of the civil rights things. Again, I don't think this is widely discussed or known. And talk about some of the Republican figures who you would, you know, who could sit down with Democrats and work out a way to, you know, fund national security issues or Social Security, whatever it may be, you know, back in that time. I think people who are, especially younger people today, just have no idea that actually at one point our government worked quite well.
Yeah, it's true. And, you know, in many ways, the foundations for American victory in the Cold War against the Soviet Union were
Sure.
laid by Republican and Democratic presidents alike. And certainly one of the most important was Eisenhower, who, you know, in many ways was very, very conservative. He certainly was the most fiscally conservative president we've had, I would say, in the last century. He balanced the budget repeatedly. He shrunk the deficit. He actually shrunk the overall number of federal employees. And in fact, the number of federal employees now is about the same as what it was.
Yeah.
In the Eisenhower administration, it's just now we have outsourced so much of government to subcontractors and the like that this is part of why government doesn't work well. But
Yeah.
the thing about Eisenhower is that he had ideas that just weren't so easily categorized into the way we think about left and right now. He
Yeah.
did, after all, put forward the biggest public works project in American history with the construction of the federal highway system.
Yes.
And he also made significant investments in science and technology and education, knowing that these were actually fundamental to America's victory over the Soviet Union. And these are
Yeah.
precisely the areas now which Donald Trump is dismantling in so many ways with the connivance of Republicans in Congress. So we're in a very different world right now. But again, this was a world in which Republicans and Democrats didn't see themselves as enemies,
Yeah.
even though might have been opponents, and they all saw themselves as engaged in a similar project of building American greatness. They did disagree on the means by which that should go forward, and Republicans typically looked for ways that would not involve overweening government, that would allow some kind of devolution to local initiative and the states, and that would be paid for because they were, as I said, fiscal conservatives. But they
Yeah.
did see themselves as opposed, for example, on the issue of civil rights. The most obdurate enemies of African American political rights were Southern Democrats.
Yes.
And Republicans actually voted for both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in greater proportions in Congress, greater percentages than the Democrats.
Yeah.
So it's just a very different kind of world.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's a kind of there's I guess you could say the inheritance of that world in an informal, non-political sense is the fact that during the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, and the early part of this century, you could see the poll numbers in Republican circles moving in favor, for instance, of gay marriage, something that you never would have thought possible if you listened to Jerry Falwell on the Capitol steps in the odd situation that Ronald Reagan provided him when he gave him I think, a Marine marching band, and they were all up there, speaking of church and state. But the fact of the matter is the American public itself not only reflected a diversity of opinion, but I think a point that your book makes so well is that there was a sort of a central moderation in both parties that doesn't exist today. So that we take it as normal that, there's this terrific conflict on culture war issues. But the other thing is if you want to put it this way, there was a sort of a sensible middle that actually was the majority. And you can see that in things that can be measured in a non-political way, like poll numbers on gay marriage that shifted in favor of gay marriage. In Republican and even evangelical circles with people who said, I disapprove of the gay, quote, lifestyle, whatever it is, but I think they, quote unquote, ought to be allowed to, and then fill in, the blank on marriage or civil unions, whatever. I think the same thing was happening with abortion rights, with people like Rockefeller and Reagan, who was pro-choice in California. Again, the culture war issues are part of what you talk about in terms of the rise of the Tea Party. But one thing I want to drill down on is when you look at people like Pat Buchanan and Newt Gingrich and so forth, what do you think were the moments when things changed? In other words, obviously MAGA and Trump makes everything glaring, sort of a glaring example of everything. But there was an evolution there, and part of it was the abortion issue becoming a litmus test. But what was it that changed specifically in America in the largest sense that meant that suddenly it wasn't cool to be a moderate in either party?
Well, I always come down on the side of believing that individual leadership matters enormously. Yeah. Although it's also true that structural factors have to be taken into consideration.
Yeah.
I really see the evolution of the Republican Party and the conservative movement as having been largely a consequence of two great leaders, Ronald Reagan on the political side and William F. Buckley on the intellectual and conservative movement side. And yes. I don't think that either republicanism or conservatism would have had the same success absent those two leaders.
Yeah, and I agree with you, by the way. You say that in your book, and I thought, hooray, someone said it, because I disagree with the point of view of history that it's all, guns, germs, and steel or whatever, that it's vast structural things. I really do think individual leadership makes a difference. And I love that you made that point in your book about Buckley and also about Ronald Reagan, because it's inexplicable without that.
And at the same time, I think they were both somewhat similar, Buckley and Reagan, in that they understood that they were themselves managing a coalition within the conservative movement.
Right.
Ronald Reagan, and Buckley, both in different ways, ended up pushing out the most extreme elements that they thought would turn off the moderate voters that they needed to win over.
Correct.
And particularly the John Birch Society was one that Buckley did his best to stigmatize.
Yes, he did.
Ronald Reagan always kept at arm's length himself, particularly after he had won his election as governor of California in 1966.
Yeah.
I think that, again, made a difference in the overall shape of the movement. The problem with Newt Gingrich, who I would identify as being a real turning moment when he won, when the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives for the first time in almost 40 years in 1994 and made Gingrich speaker, is that Gingrich was actually building upon a great deal of frustration within the Republican Party, including on the part of moderates, that they had been shut out of the majority for so long.
Yeah.
And that was the point at which being a moderate started to seem like just going along with inevitable subjection to the Democrats and their push to remake America along leftward lines. And so what Gingrich essentially did was he offered the moderates a kind of bargain, which was that elect me to leadership, follow me, I will blow up Congress as an institution,
Yes.
and then we will be able to take majority control over whatever is left of the rubble and ruins. The problem is that anti-institutional approach became institutionalized under Gingrich, and it
Yes.
continues even into the present day
Yeah.
when Republicans are almost unable to conceive of the value of institutions, and that's part of the chaos that we're experiencing now.
Yeah. And I think there were, he had people, Gingrich also was helped, I guess, by the fact that a couple things happened. First of all, on the Roman Catholic right, there was Weyrich, and then on the Roman Catholic right, there was also Pat Buchanan. But they both were very much believers in let's blow the system up. So there were these kind of intellectual voices or activist voices or bomb throwing voices, whatever, however you see Buchanan and Weyrich and these other guys. But what all of them played on, and then of course the Republicans began genius at cashing in on, was this overall sense of grievance by people who were actually the majority, but they'd begun to see themselves as a minority in terms of cultural shifts. And so something I want to get into there is that I think the leadership of Buckley was huge, and people need to remember that. And your book is incredibly valuable on that, talking about the National Review and how he started that. One thing I wanted to ask you about Bill Buckley, it just was your point of view on this, and that is how he changed in his own thinking, because obviously there was an evolution in his own ideology. There were things he wrote at certain points that I think later he might have regretted or would have put differently, in terms of the kind of conservatism he put forward. But certainly by the end, Bill Buckley was someone who could sit down, not just advocate sitting down across the aisle and that kind of Republican outreach, but he did it in his own life on firing line and the kind of guests he had. He would talk to people, even people he disagreed with vehemently and loudly on his own program. It was a completely different way of seeing things as a conservative. I don't think Bill Buckley believed in blowing the whole system up, the way Pat Buchanan did, for instance, or Weyrich or these other people. And Grievance, I never felt with Bill Buckley that his selling point was speaking for the aggrieved and the downtrodden. So I just wanted to ask you about the arc of his life and how you see that, having talked to him, but also written and really studied the progression of how the National Review shaped opinion. I just think let's talk about Bill Buckley for a minute and how he changed his own views or how he evolved.
Sure. I mean, Bill Buckley was a very complicated character, and he sort of reveled in some of those complications.
Yeah,
To give you an example that will be personal, as you say, he did go to Gstaad to ski
sure.
every winter, and he actually remembered one particular season, I think it might have been in the 70s, when he went from visiting your father at L'Abri, was that the name of
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
the home, in the next valley over, and then went skiing with David Bowie, who at that point was sort of at the
sure.
peak.
That's a typical Bill Buckley.
You
He
know,
liked
right.
being cool. Yeah,
He did like being cool, but you know what I think also about Bill Buckley is that he liked human beings,
yeah,
uh, and actually wanted them to live happy lives. And he believed that he had the answers in his own religion, but what he respected about your father was that his father, unlike some people who entered the religious right, humbled himself before God, didn't
yeah,
try to project his own politics onto God and say, what I want is actually what God wants. It
yeah.
was the other way around. And faith to your father and to Bill Buckley was often a challenge. And
Hmm.
it was that challenge to actually live up to something greater than ourselves that sometimes could force Bill Buckley to change his mind. And I think that's most vivid with the case of civil rights for African Americans.
Yeah,
Buckley's parents were both Southerners, and he actually spent part of the winter in South Carolina, where Strom Thurmond was a family friend before he
sure.
entered politics. And he wrote the infamous 1957 National Review op-ed on the South must prevail, where he said that, the white race must prevail in the South because it is the advanced race.
Yeah, and you quote that in your book.
Yes, that's right. And I also quote what Buckley said years later, which is that, on this issue, I was wrong.
Yes, I know that. Yeah.
I thought that Americans could evolve their way out of segregation, and it actually took the federal government's intervention to end Jim
Yeah.
Crow.
Yeah.
And people are so reluctant to commit to confess to any kind of error now,
Mistakes. Yeah.
especially in the political sphere, that really did stand out to me. And I think it
Yeah.
again was because Buckley was somebody who had very firm convictions and principles, but also liked people, wanted to understand where they were coming from, and sometimes that could allow him to change his mind.
Well, and the thing too about Bill that was real, I think he had a very strong, grounded sense of right and wrong. The guy, he never claimed to be a moral person himself all the time or perfect in his opinions, but he certainly was open to someone challenging him and saying, look, it's not just you got that wrong as a technicality. The God you believe in doesn't like people who think this way. I mean, not that I ever or Dad challenged him that way, but basically, Bill Buckley was a man of faith. He also had faith in his politics, as in that it was supposed to be about the right and the good. And he was always trying to find that, whether he ever succeeded or not. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Geoffrey. And we're talking about his book, Rule and Ruin, The Downfall of Moderation and the Destruction of the Republican Party from Eisenhower to the Tea Party. It came out in 2012, but it's weird because it's actually ripped from the headlines right now. In other words, if you want to understand something about where Trump came from and the MAGA movement, you really can't get there any other way than reading this book and then filling in the blanks since then. It's like, it would be like coming to the history of World War II, having never heard of World War I. or how it came out. It's an absolute must read. We're going to make it our book club offering. It has to be read in August. So we're talking today about the book Rule and Ruin, and some of the people that I knew personally, including John McCain, by the way, who I helped campaign for at one point when he was running against Sarah Palin. I was already out of the religious right and not even a Republican or voting, but they got in touch with me. Would I go on some Christian radio stations that sort of remembered the name of Francis Schaeffer, a conservative station, saying that, Sarah Palin did not necessarily represent everybody who followed my parents, for instance. So, my connections with that world remain pretty vivid until that campaign, and afterwards have really dropped off as I've become known more as a secular person or more liberal in my views. So I want to get back to the book, specifically to something that you say in the open of the book. I think it's early in the book. As the country enters the second decade of the new millennium, and of course, this was in 2012, there is an uneasy sense among many Americans that while their society and culture remain vibrant, their governing system has become quarrelsome, dysfunctional, and incapable of coping with serious national problems. And of course, this is 2012. So basically, you're talking about the Tea Party, the culture wars. Update us between then and now, because if that was true then, it's doubly so today, and almost to the point where I think a lot of us think there's no return now to any form of moderation on either side of the aisle when it comes to Congress, let alone, who sits in the White House. So how do you see that having played out between the Tea Party and the present, following that train of thought that you have in the introductory pages of your book?
So let me return to that observation that I made, which is that I come down on the side of human leadership as a motivating factor in history, and the importance I place on Bill Buckley and Ronald Reagan. I do think they brought the conservative movement and the conservatized Republican Party to a level of success it would not otherwise have known.
Sure.
However, there's a problem with that kind of personal leadership, which is that often the successors are unable to determine the secrets of that success and unable to maintain the balances that those great leaders maintained. And in both the case of Reagan and Buckley, they understood it was important to actually allow space for moderates in the party and to some extent even in the movement, and to marginalize the most extreme elements while not making them feel completely abandoned. And successors failed to maintain that balance. They heard the part where Reagan said in his inaugural address that government is not the solution, government is the problem. But then they failed to listen as a paragraph or so down. He said, that doesn't mean I want to do away with government. I want to make government work for us, not against us. And in the same way, Bill Buckley never, I think, would have wanted the conservative movement to be a nihilistic attempt to tear down all institutions and the effectiveness of government. He actually wanted it to make it work better, but that message was lost on many of his successors, as I
Yeah.
think they came to enjoy the thrill of owning the libs and making their opponents cry and making
Yeah.
them distraught at everything. And that's not a secret of the way to run a country, because a country is always going to be divided, particularly a country like the United States.
Yeah.
And I blame both the left and the right for really failing to see their opponents, not just in their complexity, but in their humanity,
Yeah.
and trying to find common ground. But at the same time, it's so easy to call moderates just weak sauce, pale pastels, an imitation of what's most satisfying about being a political human. And
Yeah.
that's what's happened to our politics.
Yeah, and of course, the irony is when it comes to actual life, daily life, who you want living next to you as a neighbor is the person who would be described as a moderate in all things and not a bomb-throwing extremist or someone who's terribly opinionated and makes all sorts of trouble. You talk about later in your book, you have something where you're saying, as the Republican Party continues to reject its own heritage and forgets the hard lessons of the 1960s, it seems increasingly likely that right-wing activists may prevail over the party professionals and nominate an extreme presidential candidate. Now, you said this in 2012, so we've now established the fact that you're a prophet, and I'm not really joking. Such a candidate might so alienate the American majority, as Goldwater did in 1964, that Republican candidates would be wiped out across the board. So what I want to talk to you about is the fact that Goldwater shocked the party because how badly he lost really was a wake-up call and provided, I guess, the way that Ronald Reagan eventually would win, because Reagan came across with a smile and knew how to do things. And very much Goldwater was not a Bill Buckley kind of person either. Um, So, the first part of that statement, you have been proved completely true and correct. Increasingly likely that right-wing activists may prevail over the party professionals and nominate an extreme presidential candidate. And then the second part of that paragraph where you say such a candidate might so alienate the American majority, as Goldwater did in 1964, that the Republican candidates would be wiped out across the board. Now, they weren't. They were in one sense that Trump's second run was terminated with the election of Joe Biden. Now he's back in office. But I would like to take that last part of your paragraph and push it into the future, because if Trump is the great man who's shaped the present, when you talk about when Ronald Reagan went away and Bill Buckley went away, there was no one really to follow in their footsteps and keep that part of the movement going. How much more that will be the case with the final accounting of the Trump second term, when he, disappears in one way or another, and the Republican Party is left with this incredibly alienated and angry, divided country. And at that point, of course, they'll be living in the world that his policies created, and Joe Biden won't be around to blame. How do you see that playing out? Because it seems to me that your story, you've told this history. We're in a very fluid moment of division at this point. But of course, that's going to have a fallout as well. So I have a basic question for you. Have you lost faith in the American experiment to the point where we feel the changes are now irreversible? Or is there going to be a kind of a righting of the balance when we reconsider what Trump did and this sort of fringe extremist element that has taken over the Republican Party and the MAGA movement becomes something in our rearview mirror as we go back to sort of fumbling along, maybe reading your book and trying to find our way back down that trail to moderation in both parties? How do you see that playing out in view of the fact that you've thought about this as much as anybody has, perhaps?
Well, that's a very searching question. Let me try to answer it by going back a little bit to my personal history as I was writing this book.
Yeah.
It was actually during Barack Obama's when he was running for re-election, and his defeat was his victory, excuse me, his victory over Mitt Romney was very demoralizing to a lot of Republicans. And at that time, the newspapers were all carrying articles like, "Is the GOP over?"
Yeah.
And this is what led the Republican Party to come to write its autopsy report, saying that it needed to moderate. And then along came Donald Trump, who took none of its advice, who actually did everything the opposite of what they suggested, and he still won. What I think I was actually a little attuned to at that point was that, it had been a disaster for the Republican Party to put Barry Goldwater forward in 1964, because what he was suggesting was so outlandish as most Americans considered it. He wanted to make Social Security, essentially do away with it, to give battlefield nuclear weapons to people, soldiers in the field.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party was not just wiped out in his battle against Lyndon Johnson, it was wiped out in Congress, even at the local level. And this gave Democrats license to remake the country much as they had in the New Deal, along very leftward lines, along lines that I personally considered to go too far to the left. And what there isn't in either party at this point, and hasn't been arguably since the 1960s, is the kind of self-restraint that will say, when we are in power, we are going to make the kind of changes that we think are necessary to move the country forward, but not in such a way that we will be vindictive toward the other party and do things to punish them. Neither side seems quite capable of doing that, and the left is certainly capable of inflicting damage on the right and disregarding their beliefs as well, when in fact what we need to do is actually learn from each other. And the right has some good ideas, which they put forward. I would say Jack Kemp's supply side ideas were exactly what was needed to bring America out of the doldrums of the 1970s and put it on a much more positive side. And arguably, even Donald Trump's populism was a necessary corrective to the kind of technocracy and left-wing ideology and victimhood and identity politics that so many Americans just despised. The problem there is that Donald Trump is what I described, I think, in the book, as my nightmare vision of a heavily muscled body without a head.
Yeah.
That kind of figure can't win elections. They can, because Trump is actually a much better demagogue, frankly, than anyone the Democrats have to put forward. And he's drawing on very real resentments that people have, which they're not wrong to have. I don't mean racial resentments. I mean the resentments of people who feel that their life is not going to be as good as their parents' lives were, whose children will suffer because they're in left behind parts of the country, or they are the wrong kind of people who are not part of this self-regarding elite. But what we need to do is move beyond that kind of angry populism toward a kind of populism that gets results, a country that works again, as Mark Dunkelman put it. And that is not what Trump is doing. Trump is actually sabotaging our ability to win what I believe to be our present Cold War against China. China is expanding by leaps and bounds in its industrial capacity. It has almost half the world's capacity at this point in manufacturing, and its advances in science and technology, which almost shock us by the day. We cannot afford to actually sabotage ourselves in this competition, which is why there needs to be some kind of movement back toward the center on both parties, I believe.
Yeah, and you're talking about, you have again later in your book, a nation as large and complex as the United States, with its world-spanning obligations and interconnections, requires both Republicans and Democrats to be serious and responsible governing parties. If moderation remains long absent from one party, let alone both, the consequences are likely to be dire. So you have made the call there. And of course, I think the consequences are dire, because I think the left has also trolled the right. I think when it was in power and in the ascendant in terms of culture war issues across the board, the left took advantage of that and did not do what you've just outlined, which is, okay, we're in power, but we're not going to use this power to push our agenda beyond what the other side is able to tolerate. And I think,
and I think part of what we're seeing now, Frank, is it's a prophecy that New York Times columnist Ross Douthat made a number of years ago. That if you don't like the Christian right, wait till you see the post-Christian right.
Yes, and I think he was so correct in that. That line, by the way, that you just quoted, completely stuck with me. I remember reading it thinking, yes, that what he said. And when you read some of the books that I've reviewed here, like Tim Alberta's book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And we talked to Tim. Tim is a devout evangelical Christian. He's not a right-winger. But what he's finding, which completely makes your point, the first place you see what Ross Douthat was talking about was in parishes themselves, where the pastor is under fire from his congregants for not being radically right-wing MAGA enough. And they're making war on him, or certain factions are, because they are far more interested in the politics than they are in anything to do with Christianity. They don't want to hear sermons about what Jesus would teach. They want to hear sermons about why Donald Trump is so great and how awful the liberals are. So it's already happening within the evangelical community. There are churches where the pastor is trying to lead them as a Christian leader, the congregation or the loudest elements in it are moving to the right. And his whole book was about that. So that's where you sort of begin to see this. They are the post-Christian right. And it's terrifying because, you think of the militias and these other people. But even when it doesn't get as extreme as that, there's a kind of a neo-paganism coming in, which is a lot more adjacent to ancient Rome than it is into anything Christian. Speaking of which, by the way, have you read Tom Holland's book Dominion?
I have, yes.
Yeah, because he's another one of these people. He's not an atheist gay Jew as the person we both talked to was with his book, but Tom comes at it, and I haven't talked to him personally, but I'll call him Tom because I listened to his podcast. The rest is history. His point is, look, as a historian of ancient Rome on why there is anything called Western civilization at all, we can't take Christianity out of this mix.
Right.
And you can't look at anything the United Nations has come up or ideas of civil rights or human rights or gay rights or feminism, and not realize that, we're swimming in this environment of a Christianized Western civilization that has all its faults. Let's not gloss them over. But that said, sort of like Ross Douthat, all right, wait till you see the alternative, when the influence is really gone. So you want to talk a little bit about, you brought that line up, how that fits in with what Tom Holland's written, how that fits in with your book, kind of, as it were, prophesying that we would be here now. And you kind of laid the groundwork for why we got here.
Yeah, I spent a lot of my earlier years in academic settings where I
Yeah,
would typically be the only conservative, but also the only believing Christian.
yeah,
Academia is very much a sort of post-religious environment, and I don't say that people who lack a formal religion can't be moral people as well.
yeah,
I want to fall into that trap. But I think the trap they did fall into was they would actually take their very negative view of Christianity and the Republican Party and the United States and roll them up into one big ball and say that
yeah,
the entire history of this country is one of oppression and evil. And we should actually seek not to actually remember this or to be patriotic. We should actually seek to sort of move beyond it and pretend that the whole thing never happened and refound the country as if it were year zero on our
yeah,
better progressive foundations. And that can't happen. The reason that this country has been flawed is that human beings are flawed.
yeah,
We also have within us, as a nation and people, the possibility of redemption, so long as we actually follow a creed that urges us to be better than our worst instincts.
yeah,
And unfortunately, it seems to me that in politics, our worst instincts are actually being foregrounded at this point.
yeah,
And that seems to be the royal road to success for so many people in and around the Trump court, as well as the sort of professional trolls on social media from the left as well. And that's why I think we actually need to return to the sense of religion as restraint, as being commanded to be other than our worst instincts and to live up to our best.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a point that's going to have to be made very clearly by people on all sides of the political spectrum, that if we can't agree on a sort of a basic moral framework of how to live with people, no one is going to do well on an individual human basis because you cannot live in this divided climate. And I and I
I could
think,
also add one thing, Frank, which is that,
yeah,
moderates can have a hubris of their own. You
yeah,
referred to the neighbor who is always moderate in all things, but that
yeah,
often will be the neighbor who thinks he's always right, too.
yeah.
And
Well,
when moderates are too much in power,
yeah.
they listen to populists, then they tend to become technocrats.
What
And
was that line you quoted by Justice Hand about?
the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right.
Yeah, I love that.
And I
And
think that's so important.
that's
Even
such a good line in your book, but I'm so glad you quoted him.
even if we're mostly right, we need to keep in mind at all times that we are fallible human beings,
Yeah,
and
and
balance has to be struck. But at the
yeah,
same time, when populists get into power, they themselves need to listen to moderates as well if they're going to govern responsibly.
yeah, yeah. You say moderates had seen their lack of a rigid ideology as an advantage since they were free to examine each issue as it came up dispassionately and on the merits, in keeping with the dictates of the founding fathers. But while this pragmatism often served moderates well in the task of governance, it unsuited them for political competition. Talk about that a little bit, because I thought that was very perceptive, but maybe you can unpack that a little, because that's a key to sort of understanding why moderates are not sexy, as it were. They're not loud enough. It hinders them because precisely, they're not the sort of people that the populist Trump or the left-wing populists like Bernie Sanders and others would that, oh, these are boring people. They're petty functionaries. They're into, their little thing here, but, we need real leaders. I mean, how does that work? Because as you point out with Ronald Reagan and Bill Buckley, they were real leaders. These were very charismatic people who had real
Yeah.
followings and were able to move things. But on the other hand, they didn't move them in an immoderate direction to the point where they broke the country. And now we've sort of gone in the left and right to that point. So how do you have that sort of the leadership of a strong woman or strong man or whomever it may be that steps forward, but at the same time, they're really into the common good. And that seems to be in tension.
That's an incredibly incisive question. I remember talking with Doug Bailey, who was a political consultant who preferred to have moderate Republican clients back when that was possible. And yet
Yeah.
he said, the real problem with moderates is that they are moderate.
Yeah.
The idea
Yeah.
of waving the sword of moderation and leading a parade down the street is just antithetical to who they are. They
Yeah.
want to go home and pat the dog
Right.
and watch TV, and they're not that's not suitable when you're in competition with ideologues who are out there banging away and who are sacrificing every other dimension of their life to win political victory.
Yeah.
So what you need is to actually have fiery moderates who believe that their cause is so important that they can inspire others to follow them. And maybe that's the situation that we're coming into now as the country seems like it's falling apart. And this 80-year US-led global order is also going to fall apart in ways that will really hit home negatively with most Americans. Maybe then moderates can actually recover that sense of fire, but they are temperamentally disadvantaged in many
Yeah.
ways. Dealing with
Yeah. And they're
extreme
not, and
opinion.
they're disadvantaged in our clickbait. I mean, one thing that your book doesn't get into too specifically, which of course has been exacerbated immensely by Elon Musk and the whole, tech bro thing and so forth. Again, and I don't want to throw one at you from left field here, but if you were writing your book today, on the filling the gap in between the Tea Party and now, in the 19 in when you wrote your book, the impact of what technology would do in terms of phones and clickbait and Twitter and all this was beginning, but it hadn't shown its full ugly face at this point. We didn't know as much as we know now about who these people are, what Google has done to us, and so forth and so forth. But in I think another challenge is that it's not only just a question of going back to a more moderate point of view, the entire delivery system of information is immoderate. In other words, Ernie, Greg and my producer and I joke and say, well, we are the media now. The gatekeepers are gone. And I'm still trying to do an old-fashioned job of actually reading the book, preparing, talking rationally, speaking with people who I disagree with sometimes, whatever it may be. But we're a diminishing number. When we had the editor of the Wall Street Journal on one time, we would get responses from some of my viewers saying, okay, if you had somebody like that on, I'll never watch your thing. I'll never listen to you again. The
Right.
very fact that you would want to even talk with the enemy, as it were, as they would see him because he works for Rupert Murdoch and Murdoch, and so forth and so on and so on. In that environment where clickbait is driving the whole thing, in which people are coming into universities, and that includes the Ivy League, telling their professors they don't have the capacity to read as many books are being assigned, this whole picture, how does that further skew it towards the immoderate extremes where you don't have the actual forums for having the discussions are going away, and people are used to and driven by the algorithms into these narrowing circles where they're only talking to people who say things like them, to the point where Frank Schaeffer wants to talk to the editor of the Wall Street Journal and ask him how he sees the world. And okay, I can't listen to you anymore because of this. You've done this thing now. And in that environment, that's something that neither Eisenhower or Reagan dealt with. Bill Buckley started a magazine. He didn't do it in tweets. So how do you see that informing us now? And how do you at the center deal with this and some of the people you're talking to in your podcast? In other words, this aspect of the tech invasion of all of our lives with a less and less moderate message, no matter how it's framed, just because of the form it comes in and the algorithms that push controversy.
I'm old enough to remember the 90s when the idea was that the internet was going to make all of our lives better.
Yeah.
And that by
Right.
being in touch with people who we didn't know and who would come from a very different place in life, who we might disagree with, we could actually find a way toward understanding each other better.
Right.
But the key thing about a social media forum is that it has to have moderation. And that means moderation in two senses. On the one hand, some human being to say that
Sure.
is out of line, I'm taking it down. And on the other hand, to say you cannot go to the extremes that you are going to.
Right.
We're also in a situation where there may be an enemy that we will all confront, which is AGI.
Yeah.
And AI sort of taken to the level of superhuman intelligence that will then decide that humans are as irrelevant to the
Yeah.
planet as cockroaches and do away with us all. And, I think it's actually a time for all of us in the face of what may be a common threat to think about what it is that makes us distinctively human. And I
Hmm.
was really struck in your writing about your father, about how attuned your father was to art and the beauty to be found in art
Right.
and what was profoundly human about that beauty. And I think that's something that we need to recover that will really distinguish us, I think, from machine intelligences and recover human intelligence at its best.
This is an odd question to ask toward the end of an interview, but I'm going to ask it because I'm so intrigued. I've read your book and I've read something about what you do um, with the center and some of the people you interview, but I want to get sort of more personal here and just say, well, sort of who are you in that, like, I know you're on a journey because we all are. People sometimes will read a book of mine and I have to explain to them, well, that's what I wrote then, sort of a la Bill Buckley.
Yep.
And I'm sorry I felt that way because I think I was wrong about, many issues. But I also know that you're on a journey because you're a thinking person and you've done things. How do you see your own journey from where to where? I don't know how religious you are. I'm not presuming anything. I'm really asking you, but also just, my attention is very much on my family and the relationships I have, um, grandchildren and so forth and so on. But it's certainly the person I am is not necessarily reflected in what I'm doing here today or what I write about or my commentary, which tends to be more on politics and current affairs, but is not actually where I live in my head, which is much closer to what you're talking about, trying to find the intrinsic worth of beauty in life itself. These things that are very hard to communicate, especially in an environment of the whole clickbait thing we're talking about. So I want to end up just talking about you personally to whatever extent you will, because I think you're such an interesting person and there's so much wisdom in your book. Who are you? Where are you journeying to and from? You talked about Ross Douthat, and I know he's a conservative who's converted to the Roman Catholic Church from an evangelical background, very much like mine. So he's on that journey. Um, what's your journey? How would you sort of sum it up? And I don't want to hurry you on this, whatever you'd like to say. I'm just curious.
Again, excellent questions. And just to answer the basic question about religion, I was raised Catholic with a sort of recessive strain of Episcopalianism, and I mostly go to Episcopal churches now
Hmm.
when I do. Although I also recently been going to my friend David Gray's Presbyterian Church in Bethesda, and it has a lot of what characterizes strong Christianity to me,
Hmm.
in terms of a very supportive congregation and intelligent ministry. Where I am is trying to find my way as a human being, having had my own tragedies to contend with, one of which is that I don't have a wife or family, though I very much wanted them. And
Hmm.
so I
Hmm.
was wondering about what set me on that path, and also empathizing with particularly young men nowadays who feel very isolated from the world, alienated, angry at the opposite sex, wanting the kind of future that their parents had and feeling that they're not going to get it.
Yeah.
I'm somebody who was raised to study and learn from American greatness properly conceived.
Hmm.
My heroes and the people I wrote about were the people who overcame the Depression, won World War II, and then set out to build a more just order than the one that had led to the cataclysms of World Wars I and II. And in many ways, I think that's still the vision of American goodness and greatness to which we ought to aspire, but both left and right have lost faith in it for their own
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
And I think, that moderation is not a word that anyone wants to hear nowadays, but I think that people might actually respond better to the idea that why are we breaking this order that has worked so well for all of us for our entire lifetimes and the lifetimes of most of our grandparents? Ought we
Yeah.
not want that for our own children and descendants? And if so, then how are we to actually take up the responsibility that history has thrust upon us to maintain this good and just world order?
Mm,
And I suppose that's what I'm working toward in the work that I do. But I also have my own personal project of wanting to visit 1,000 museums
good one.
around the world, in this country, in the next. I'm up to 600 something at this point. I think that we might actually be nicer to each other if we all did visit art museums once in a while with an open mind and try to learn from them as well as each other.
Yeah, I love that. And that well, if you're, even before you get to your thousand, I think there's a book there too, because uh, Museum Odyssey. I go to museums quite a bit, and always have, but I really love the idea that that's what you're doing. So that's great. We're going to make Geoffrey's book our book club book. And once again, it's Rule and Ruin, the Downfall of Moderation and the Destruction of the Republican Party from Eisenhower to the Tea Party. It's a 2012 book, but it is like the first half of a book ripped from the headlines today, the half that explains how we got here. You can't understand the Republican Party or the Democratic Party unless you read this book, which is a bold claim, but I really mean it. I've learned so much from it. We've only scratched the surface of my notes. Let me tell you, let me just look at this page here that I had, and I'm not making this up. My notes that I wrote from your book, I have 21 pages, 5,570 word of notes that I wrote. So we have not even touched it, but I say that only to let people know that I was absorbed. I really got into it, and it's a terrific book. So I hope people read it. And then, if you would stick around for a minute after I sign off here and talk to my producer Ernie, so we can make sure that we can properly promote what you're doing and tie in our links to your center. And I would urge people to follow Jeff's podcast. He interviews incredible people, and you're very good at it. I loved reading the transcripts as well. I mean, they're so quotable, and we didn't get into enough of that either, but it's terrific. So thank you so much for taking this time.
Well, thank you, Frank. And one of the other things that I think I have been searching for much of my life are wise people whom I can learn from. Sometimes they acquire that wisdom through walking a very stony path through life. I don't
Yeah.
know the extent to which your path has been rough or smooth, but I really appreciate your attention to my book, your intelligent questions, and your own wisdom. And I
Well,
feel like
thank you, because
I'm not
I
even.
feel the same.
Thank you.
I felt, and anything that we can ever do, or something, anything you're doing, I'm interested in. Let me just put it that way. So please keep us current on what you're up to.
Well, thank you, Frank.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.